Okay, so it's 13 days, 13 days until I go and get my ADHD diagnosis with a psychiatrist. And I thought I would explain why I decided to actually go and get diagnosed in the first place. And to be clear, it took me like 6 months to actually finally get my butt into gear and get the GP referral, the doctor referral to go and see a psychiatrist. So last year, I had a discussion because I interview women from around the world through my pageant business. Winding that back now, but interviewed like 300 women from around the world. And last year, I had a coaching session with one of these young women, Eliza, and we ended up having like supposed to be a 1 hour coaching session. Ended up, and it was about an hour and a half of coaching, and then the last 3-4 hours we were talking about ADHD because she's diagnosed with ADHD. She's also a medical student, and so she's done a lot of almost guinea pig research on herself in terms of getting diagnosed, trying different medications and things like that. And that first got the ball in my head rolling. Like, when you go to get a diagnosis, you need to have a reason. Like, what made me think, for example, that I might have ADHD that made me want to go and get diagnosed. It's not like you just walking on the street and go, I've got nothing else to do, I'll go and be diagnosed for ADHD. So that got the ball rolling in my head. I will say also, over the 300 interviews, very often the best conversations, the best interviews that I've had on or off camera have been with people who come from the so-called neurodivergent community. So not necessarily people with ADHD, but ADHD, autism, Asperger's, synesthesia, can't say it, things like that. And that, I gotta admit, that made me think quite often because I've always thought I was a little bit different. Ever since I was a kid, I thought I was a bit weird, didn't fit in, always looking for a place to belong and never really found it. And so I'd already had the inkling in my head that it's a bit weird, for example, that person with autism, Asperger's and synesthesia I have so much in common with in terms of the way my brain seems to work, because that's where the conversation went. I wasn't guessing. We talked a lot about how we think, how we organize. And then when I had this discussion with Eliza, I was like, okay. And she's a med student, so she said, you really should probably go and get tested. Not from a judgmental point of view, but just because she really thought that there's a high chance that I may have ADHD. And so that's part of it. So thinking that I might have it. The other part of it is I'm always someone who's wanting more. Like, I love brain hacks, this idea that you can, 2x, 10x your productivity or whatever. I once was a raw foodist, so that's like a vegan, but can't even cook food, can't process food. So for example, you can't even have any canned goods because all canned goods are heated when they're put in the can. So I once was a raw foodist for about a year, just because I thought it was the ultimate way of living and living longer and having more energy and never getting sick and all that. So I do love doing experiments on myself just to push to see what's possible. And the idea that ADHD, for example, for me, as someone who didn't struggle really at school at all, but I did struggle in secondary school and high school, and then I struggled a lot in university. But I didn't struggle in primary school learning math and things like that because that's just the way my brain worked. But as someone who thought that ADHD might be holding me back from my full potential, that idea really bugged me. That really got to me. It's not like I had trouble paying attention as a kid. I've since learned, obviously, that that's not the only sign of ADHD, and that's a very stereotypical sign, that there are other types of ADHD, inattentive, for example. I wanted to go down this diagnosis path to see if it could help me not just be more productive, but create a better quality of life. And the thing that's really tricky to know is because it's your brain inside your head, you never really know whether that's normal, right? You never really know whether that's the way other people are thinking or whether you're thinking differently and whether you're sort of within the bell curve of what's deemed normal. And so that's why I decided I want to go and get diagnosed. And the reason, because I'm booked in to see a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, if you don't know what the difference is, psychiatrist is a medically trained doctor, a psychologist is not. So the psychiatrist can prescribe medication, the psychologist cannot. But to see a psychiatrist, at least here in Australia, you need a referral from your general practitioner, your family doctor, your GP. And the reason I wanted to go down the psychiatrist route was because I wanted medication to be an option. Because from doing the little research that I have done into ADHD, there are quite a few experts in it who say, look, you got to get the brain, the chemistry, the biochemistry right first before you try all the other non-medical stuff. And to be clear, the non-medical stuff is important too. The most effective treatments for ADHD seem to be multimodal. So not just one treatment, not just CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, not just medication, but, a combination. So I wanted the medication to be an option as someone who's normally hesitant about medication. But when you kind of read ADHD experts and they're saying, look, one of them, I can't remember who it was, but the guy who wrote ADHD 2.0, and he said that trying to deal with ADHD without medication is like trying to tell someone who can't see that they should just squint really hard. Like if you're really short-sighted, like I am, and just telling me, oh, you should just squint hard. It's like, no, get some glasses and then go and do all the other stuff. So that analogy really pushed me over the edge and made me think, okay, psychologists or psychiatrists can give you the diagnosis, at least here in Australia, but only a psychiatrist can actually prescribe the medication. And if I want to go down that route, there's no point going to see a psychologist first, because if I wanted to get the medication, I would then need to go and see a psychiatrist as well. And so I might as well just go and see a psychiatrist, get the diagnosis done once rather than 2 or 3 times. Because it's not like you can take the diagnosis from a psychologist, go to a psychiatrist and say, yeah, I got diagnosed by that psychologist, so hey, you psychiatrist, give me medication. They'll have to do their own diagnosis. So that's why I decided to go and get booked in. I will say I have, because of the way diagnosis works, it's a conversation with your mental health professional, with your psychiatrist, psychologist. It's not like they can scan you and say, yes, you have ADHD. You need to have a conversation, and I think it would really behoove you, and certainly, and this is the way I'm taking it anyway, I'm not going to tell you what to do, that's not what I'm here to do, but I really feel like I need to educate myself as much as possible about ADHD before I go in to have that diagnosis, because the frustration that I have with diagnosis tests for ADHD, at least the ones I've taken so far, is you look at the question and they tend to be like that multiple choice spectrum, like can't pay attention. Does this apply to you? Not at all, a little bit, sometimes, always, like often, always, like it's that scale rating. How often do you fidget, for example? It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And obviously, if you want a diagnosis of ADHD, you know which one you should put down. Conversely, if you don't want the diagnosis, you also know which one you should put down. So I'm like, I need something that's actually going to be a real diagnostic test that doesn't involve what I want out of the test. So that's why I decided that I really needed to educate myself so that I could give more accurate, educated responses to the questions that I assume the psychiatrist is going to be asking me. Because I've heard from multiple people who've gone to get diagnosed, good stories and bad stories. And really, the bad ones seem to be where the psychologist or psychiatrist doesn't seem to listen, or they have very preconceived, okay, if you have this, you can't have ADHD, or you have this, you definitely have ADHD. And I almost want to go into that diagnosis, into that session, knowing, I'm not going to say knowing more than the psychiatrist, they're a trained doctor, but knowing as much as I can about a disorder that presents so differently in everyone. There's no one size fits all. And so as part of that, because I interviewed so many people through pageantry, as I said, hundreds of people, I know quite a few people around the world, most of them young women because it's pageantry. and I've organized to interview. I think I have 4 booked in, another couple in the wings waiting to book in, and I will pursue some others. But I'm basically going to interview people with ADHD, get their stories. I'll be reading books as well and all this material on ADHD, but I really feel that in order to understand something, you need to talk to someone who's gone through it, or who's going through it, what we like to call lived experience. And that's how I actually got into pageantry. I was like, I dismiss pageantry as being somewhat shallow and stupid, but I like to challenge my presuppositions to see if they're right. And so I started interviewing pageant girls. And so, just through wanting to hear people's stories, I became one of the foremost, let's say, pageant experts. I hate that word, but, I became a figure in the industry, pretty well known. And now I want to do that with ADHD, not to become famous, but just to educate myself. And yes, reading the books is important, and I am doing that. I got a stack of books. I think I got 4 books waiting for me to finish. But I really feel nothing can take the place of speaking to someone who has that lived experience. Or at the very least, you should be doing both. The academic, formal education, and then talking to people who have lived experience. And so that's what I'll be doing. And so if you want, make sure you're subscribed here, because I'll be releasing those interviews, an edited version of those interviews here. And when I say edited, I mean edited down for ADHD friendly consumption, because I know I previously have done live interviews and they can often go on for an hour, and I've enjoyed it. But I'm not going to say that it's the easiest or best format for someone else to consume. So I'll be editing them down so that it's the most, let's say, poignant or substantive parts that I leave in. I'll upload them here so you guys can share in that conversation. But if you have some story, or you think you'd like to jump on an interview, or you're a psychologist or psychiatrist, for God's sakes, I'd love to educate myself as much as possible about ADHD, and I'd also love to spread that information out, to get that information out to as many people as possible in an ADHD friendly way. Because if you're anything like me and you look up ADHD, it's overwhelming. Oh, absolutely overwhelming, the amount of content that's out there. And it becomes a bit religious, which is not good. And by that I mean, like, there's people who are like ADHD proponents, and then there's ADHD cynics. And I don't want to be either one. I want to be square in the middle. I don't want to go and say that everything in the world shows that you have ADHD. It's like, oh, you got an itchy foot, like I do right now, you must have ADHD. I don't want to be that person, but neither do I want to be that person just goes, no, you can't have ADHD. ADHD is widely overdiagnosed and no one has it. It just means you don't have discipline, it just means you haven't run around. And I want to be right in the middle. And I think that involves me getting out there and finding out some information myself. Because again, if you're anything like me, reading information is one thing, but you tend to trust information more when you've got it yourself, when you've gone out and searched for it, because that dopamine kicks in. And so that's what I want to do. So if you're someone who has a story to share, or you're a psychologist, psychiatrist, you have a story to share, do let me know. Through YouTube, I guess you can send me a DM, send me an email, info@adrianjkwan.com. I'll see it or comment underneath this video, but I would love to share more stories from the ADHD community, hear more about your lived experience, and then hopefully when I go in to have my diagnosis done in 13 days, I will know, I'll be in as best position as possible to ask the right questions and to give, the right answers in inverted commas, because it's pretty daunting, as I said, because you can't just sit there and, have a scan done. You need to give answers, and knowing that the answers will determine whether you're diagnosed or not, it's kind of difficult, right? Don't know how to answer. So let me know. 13 days until diagnosis. Wish me luck.